Hi folks, this is John Bremer. I'm here to share a strategy for making writing feedback more meaningful and manageable. So I am recording this as a video because I wanted to model one way to use or create materials to make a blended learning or flipped classroom setup for your instruction. The idea is that you're creating materials such as videos, other documents, other multimedia that you then share with your students, and they're able to go through them at their own pace. They're able to rewind, fast forward, and it's much more differentiated and individualized learning setup. So I'm modeling that for you. This is the first chapter of our year-long discussion of checking for understanding and feedback. So I'm presenting the first time, and then every month I'm going to ask each Course-alike team to come up with one strategy that they found to be effective that they can share with the group. So with no further ado, here's my strategy for making writing feedback more meaningful and manageable. So we start with a couple of essential questions. First of all, how do we ensure that students are using feedback to improve their writing? And I think this is a frustration that a lot of us have, is that we spend hours and hours grading papers and providing comments and feedback, and then we don't really know if the students are looking at those comments or feedback, or even if they are, if they're able to use them to improve their writing going forward. So we want to make sure that whatever form of feedback we're using is actually useful for the students. It's something that they can process, they can use to inform their writing assignments in the future. And then, how do we make our writing feedback more efficient and timely? So something I've struggled with in the past, I'm sure most of us have struggled with this in the past, the feedback loop in English can be rather slow. I mean, it takes us a while to get through a stack of essays, and oftentimes if a week goes by, students have already kind of lost the thread of what they're writing about, and so the idea is, how do we actually get through that stack of papers more quickly and get that feedback back to our students in a more timely manner? So in order to frame this strategy, there are three essential understandings of best practices for providing feedback. The first is that too much feedback is as ineffective as not enough. And this might seem counterintuitive because we're kind of trained to give as much feedback as possible at all times. But this feedback needs to be strategic, and I'm going to go into that more in the next slide. But the idea is that too much feedback can definitely overwhelm students and make them kind of not confused as to what the actual priority is for a given writing assignment. The second part is the second understanding is we should only formally assess what we have taught. So we oftentimes are looking at papers and we're marking them up, and we're seeing that students aren't using commas correctly, or we're seeing that students don't know how to write an MLA format, or to format their papers correctly, or how to embed quotations. And so we mark students off for these problems, but with the assumption that they've learned these skills in the past. And that's an assumption that we cannot make. I mean, we have a lot of students from a variety of educational backgrounds, not all of whom went to Westland, not all of whom have learned the skills necessary for 9th grade, 10th grade, 11th grade, 12th grade. So the idea is that we need to assess students according to where they are now, and in order to assess them, we have to be able to teach them the skills that they need. It's a pretty obvious point, but another maybe fairly obvious point is that formative feedback is more useful than summative, and the students tend to emphasize the summative grade more because it's it's oftentimes worth more points. But ultimately, the summative grade, or the summative feedback, is it really worth it to give feedback on a summative assessment? Because at a summative assessment, it's an endpoint. Summative assessments, summative writing tasks, we usually don't allow students to go back and revise this. The idea is that they've gone through a writing process to get to that summative task, and that it's important that they receive feedback along the way of the writing process so that they're actually, that final summative piece of writing that they submit is polished, it's their best work. So here's an example of the traditional form of giving writing feedback. So what do you see in this picture? You'll notice that, first of all, obviously a lot of red ink. You also notice that there doesn't seem to be a clear focus for the feedback. I mean, these are global comments. So marking up everything from punctuation to syntax. Looks like you've got maybe some grammatical errors here, maybe some comments about the ideas in the essay, maybe some comments about the organization of the essay. And so these comments are all over the place. And this is, I think, one of our tendencies as English teachers is we want to be able to fix everything all the time. And the problem with that is number one, it takes a long time to grade this way. And number two, when students get a paper like this back, they're often confused and overwhelmed as to what their next step is. What is the actual priority here that they need to focus on? And so teachers often, like in this kind of model of giving feedback, they'll write all these comments and then they'll get to the end and write some general comments and there will be a grade there. And I remember getting papers like this back from my teachers, and the tendency on the student side is just to look at the grade, and if they're happy with the grade, it goes into the backpack, they don't look at it again. If they're not happy with the grade, then they might look at the comments to see where they went wrong, but oftentimes it's not really related to the next writing assignment. So if this is a summative assessment, they don't have anything to do with that feedback. So here's a strategy that I've been experimenting with over the last couple of years about a way to focus our feedback to make it more efficient and for students to be more involved in the process before the teacher even looks at the paper. So this strategy is using the comment function in Google Docs for students to self-review their writing before turning it in. And if you like to use peer review in your class, this will also work with that peer review process, because the student should be self-reviewing before the peer sees it as well. And the idea is that you're focusing in on 3 to 5 skills that are on your rubric that you want the student to be very conscious of how they are using those skills in their writing. And so if it's a shorter piece of writing, less formal piece of writing, you might only use 1 or 2 skills. Like if you're just doing a journal entry, you might ask them to use a positive phrase in the sentence just to make sure they know how to use that skill, and so that you're also not having to wade through pages and pages of journal entries when really you're focusing on the skill that you're teaching and assessing the student's ability with that skill. And so some of the ways that I've kind of framed the comments that the students make is, so I give them a rubric, and I'll show you an example of a rubric in a second, but I give them a rubric that tells them what 3 to 5 things I'm looking for in this particular piece of writing. And you might have multiple drafts of this piece of writing, and you might change those 3 to 5 things. If you feel like the class as a whole has mastered one of those skills, you don't need to continue with that. So then the next draft, you might ask them to do something else. So besides just identifying where they've included those skills in their writing, you also want them to have some kind of reflective part of it, or making their thinking visible while they're writing their comments. And so 3 possible types of comments that students could make would be to evaluate their skill level, to explain the intended effect of using a certain type of language, or explain their rationale for the way they wrote a certain part of their essay, or the way they structured a part of their essay. So this is a way for the students to be reflective on their writing before the teacher even looks at it, and also to just reconfirm to the students what it is exactly specifically that they are supposed to be focusing on in that essay. So I've got a couple examples for you. The first is a longer formal essay that my IB 11 students write. And there's a formal IB rubric, but I create for each step of the drafting process a shorter rubric that hones in on what I want them to look for. So in this rubric, there are 3 things that I'm going to give them feedback on. The first is a strong thesis statement, and then I tell them what kind of to identify their thesis statement and what kind of comment I'm asking them to make on the thesis statement. So what I really care about is that the thesis statement is debatable, because my class had some trouble with that concept of what does a debatable thesis actually look like. The second skill we're looking at is transitions. And so I'm asking them to comment on 3 transitions in their essay and then explain their reasoning for using them. So they're thinking about the way that their ideas are connected and why they chose a transition to connect those ideas. And then finally, I'm asking them to identify 2 quotes that have been integrated into their writing. And for each one, I want them to identify 1 quote that they feel like is effectively integrated, and 1 quote that I think is ineffectively integrated or is weaker. And to analyze those quotes and the integration and explain why it's ineffective, why it's not ineffective, and how it might be improved. So that's the setup. This is what I'm asking them to do on this draft. When you take a look at the essay itself, this is what it would look like with the student self-review comments. So scrolling down, the student wrote this essay about The Plague by Camus. And okay, so the comments, because this was his final draft, the comments were removed, but I wrote up some sample comments on it. So basically, okay, so the first thing I asked them to look for is to tell me where their thesis statement is, and also what are some possible alternative or opposing arguments. So the idea would be there should be some kind of, in order for the thesis to be debatable, there could be a different argument made related to that same topic. And so my feedback was that this thesis statement is actually pretty strong in that he accurately analyzes the weather and accurately is able to say what makes it debatable. But the problem is that his lead into the thesis statement is way too long, and there's a lot of kind of irrelevant information. The introduction is kind of all over the place. So I told him the thesis statement was fine, it's just that the lead into the thesis statement needs to be revised and shortened. The next comment they make is about quote integration, and so the pattern here is that he's using colons to separate the introduction and the quote itself. So I would just tell him that it should be a semicolon. And also that you repeat this structure, this type of quote integration throughout your essay. And I might actually, there's a good kind of summary here of how to properly integrate quotes. So I might say check out this resource and copy and paste this kind of guide on how to correctly integrate quotes into my comment. And then it's the same problem with this one at the bottom. Again, you're using the same. You're using a colon incorrectly here, and please look at this link to see other ways to integrate your quotation. Um, also, your quotes should not be this long. What is the most essential language in this quote? All right, and then finally, so looking at transitions again, he does a pretty good job using the transitions and explaining why he used them. One thing I would say is revisit your paragraph structure. Do you have a clear topic and supporting argument? A clear topic sentence, supporting argument for each paragraph. Okay, so that's just some examples of like how I would respond to his comments. The idea is that I'm not reading his whole paper. I'm reading only the things that we discussed are focus for this this step in the writing process, and so I can see very quickly if he understands the concepts that I've taught regarding the debatable thesis statement, regarding transitions, and regarding embedding quotes. And what's nice about this is that instead of me just giving one-sided feedback, it becomes a bit of a conversation. So for his next draft, I can look at these comments again and see where he's actually improved these skills. One other example I want to show you, this is a less formal, this is actually just a journal entry free write type of assignment that I did as a pre-assessment with my 10th graders. And I asked them to write about a rite of passage that they've gone through in their own life. And I wanted to see how comfortable they were with using imagery and figurative language in their writing. So I asked them, they were to write a paragraph describing this experience of this coming of age, and I asked them to use imagery and figurative language, one example of imagery and figurative language, and make a comment explaining the intended effect of each one. And so this student, she identifies the use of crimson as imagery, which to me, it seems she's not really clear on the concept that imagery has to be descriptive. You can't just use a word. The word crimson is very evocative, but I don't think it's enough to really be considered imagery. And so I would maybe respond to her and just say, imagery requires vivid sensory description. Does this qualify? And for her figurative language, she uses simile here. It says someone's tears landed on him like in a fairy tale. And she writes that the simile emphasizes the reality of the situation, which how does comparing it to a fairy tale make it more realistic? Okay, and so what's nice here is this is really just like a pre-assessment. I want to see how well they remember these concepts. I know they've been taught these concepts before, but I want to see how firm they have a grasp of them. And what I like about this is instead of having to and I would read the whole thing, but instead of having to hunt through here for an image, she's telling me where the image is, and I can see that her understanding the concept of imagery is a little bit weak, and that she would I would need to review this with her what an actual image and writing looks like. Same thing with simile. She knows what a simile is, but the effect of the simile is actually the opposite of what she states here. Maybe she just this is a typo, but I would wonder if she's able to actually understand why an author would use a simile and what would be the what would be the purpose of that? So those are two examples, and again, like this goes pretty quickly because you're really just scanning through and looking for what the students have identified. And number one, do they understand the concept that you taught? Number two, are they able to reflect and make their thinking visible on those concepts? And so instead of having to read pages and pages, you're really looking for comments and the things that they are pointing out in their own writing. So here are some benefits for students. Students must demonstrate an understanding of the rubric and requirements of the assessment. So just by pointing these things out, they know exactly what the teacher is looking for, and I know that they know, so there's no confusion. Students must reflect on their own writing throughout the process, but so anytime they're making a comment on their own writing, they're pointing things out. I can see to what level they understand the skills and concepts. By focusing on a few aspects of their writing, feedback is more meaningful and less overwhelming. Again, remember that paper with all the red markings on it, and what does the student do with that? And finally, it's more of a two-way conversation with the teacher instead of teacher giving feedback that the student hopefully adopts. The teacher can actually see the process in motion here. For the benefits for the teacher, students do more of the work by analyzing their own writing. Feedback is focused and specific to the requirements of the writing task, and less time grading papers, more time having a life. So that's the end of my part, the strategy that I've used. Something worth trying if you want to try to be more strategic with the way that you're giving feedback on writing. So now it's your turn. We're going to have a part of each department meeting this month will be given over to members of the Course Select team who have a strategy that they'd like to share for making feedback more meaningful and manageable. So this is, again, because checking for understanding feedback is our instructional focus, but also because we'd like to hear from each other, and I think there's a lot of brilliant ideas floating around out there that would benefit the department as a whole. So thanks so much for listening, and enjoy the rest of your day.